Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tanvi, like Sophia introduced. My pronouns are she and they. I am honored to welcome you all to the amazing panel discussion on a feminist approach to climate justice. Today, we will discuss the intersectional nature of climate justice and the importance to incorporate a feminist outlook towards the ongoing climate crisis. Let us welcome our esteemed panelists with a round of applause as I introduce them. So our first panelist is Disha Ravi. She is an Indian youth climate activist and the founder for Fridays for Future India. Coming from a family of farmers, Disha got into environmental activism early in her life. Her activism journey focuses on the climate justice movement in India, especially policies around climate change and environmental crisis. She relentlessly fights against the recent EIA draft, which prevents environmental clearance of certain projects declared strategic by the government, as well as against opening of new coal mines in India. Thank you for joining us today, Disha. Our next panelist is Valentina Ruas. I hope that was correct. She's a youth activist from Brazil, co-founder of SOS Amazonia, and a member of Fridays for Future Brazil. Growing up, she recognized the connection between environmental justice and social inequalities. She fights to bring about a system change within the climate action movement and draw global attention to the dangers of dissent in the current Brazilian political climate. She has worked for the SOS Amazonia project to protect the rights of indigenous communities and create a safe space for them as they combat COVID-19. Thank you for joining us today, Valentina. Next, we have Maria Reyes. Maria is a young ecofeminist and human rights activist from Mexico. They are a leading member of the Feminist Action for Climate Justice Coalition of the UN Women Generation Equality Forum. They are also a part of Fridays for Future International, Fridays for Future MAPA, and the Indigenous Future Network in Mexico. Drawing on the difference between climate justice and climate action, they urge the global north to diversify their mitigation and adaptation strategy to the areas most affected. Thank you for being here today, Maria. And last but not the least, we have Farzana Faruk Jhumu. She is a young climate activist based in Dhaka, Bangladesh. She's a co-founder of Cat Pencil, an organization for teaching underprivileged children and ensuring children's rights. She's also part of Fridays for Future Bangladesh. As Bangladesh undergoes the impact of cyclones, floods, and droughts, she urges the global north to take responsibility of the effects of global warming and make the climate justice movement more intersectional. She urges the media and activists from the global north to recognize their privilege and pass the mic to MAPA and indigenous communities. Thank you for being here, Farzana. Yeah. Yes, so now we would like to show you the audience present here with us today to give you an idea of how many people are here, but a bit more about how excited we all are for you to be here. Okay. Hi from Germany. So, yeah, very excited people. Okay, so like Sophie explained, the format would be we start with a few moments. We would like our panelists to say a few words about their cause and the themes that they are currently working on regarding the climate crisis. And then I'll kick off the conversation with the questions that we all have regarding the panel today. So, Disha, I would like to start with you. Could you tell us a bit more about the causes that you support and the themes that you're working on right now? Hi.
I for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I work a lot with Fridays for Future in India, and currently we're working on protecting Hasdeo Forest in Chhattisgarh. It is a region that is very rich in coal, and it has been used by a lot of big firms for opening up coal mines repeatedly, but it's also the home for indigenous people there, and they have been consistently putting up a fight to save their homeland, but it hasn't been successful because indigenous people, or Adivasis as they're called in India, are often slapped with a lot of court cases. They disappear without anyone knowing. It's always covered up, and so they don't make it to any reports. So it's a very hard place for them to be in. To continue this fight, it's a little better for people from urban areas, but we are dealing with huge corporations like Adani, and it is they have a huge fan following also in India. But yeah, it's a very tricky fight to continue because of how complicated the issue is and how complicated it can get. So that's what we're currently working on.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for bringing that up. And yes, I also agree, being an Indian, about the Adani part. And it's really important that you bring about this, that you're working towards this cause. It's really important, and we're very glad that you're taking this up. Thank you. Next, I would like to ask Farzana, what are you currently working on, and what are the causes that you support more?
Thank you. You already mentioned a lot in the introduction, and thank you for that. And currently, we are working in our country is we are trying to lobby with our government so that they actually transit to renewable energy. And also, as Disha mentioned, India have like some impact on Bangladesh as well. So they are actually building with Indian government coal power plant, which is very close to Sundarban, the biggest mangrove in the world. So it is actually harming Sundarban, and that's why we are trying to stop that. And there is another in the same district, which is called Matabari coal power plant, which is funded by Japanese government, and they are actually they dis- uh, they actually declared that they will no longer fund any power plant which is based on coal, but still they are building a power plant in Bangladesh, and that's why we are currently trying to lobby with our government so that they actually stop. And also our government recently stopped like 10 coal power plant which was about to build, but they are transitioning to gas. And gas is also another fossil fuel, so we are trying to say that no, let's shift to renewables. So that's what we are currently trying to do, meeting our ministry and letting them know what we want.
Yeah. Yes, thank you for sharing. That's one of these very important topics about the shift to renewables that I guess a lot of countries around the world are struggling with. But we are glad that you're taking that up, and we are there in your support. Next, we have Maria. Would you like to say more about your cause and the themes that you're working on?
Yeah, totally. Let me know if you don't hear me well. But thank you so much for inviting us first. I feel very honored to be sharing this panel with all of you. And what I'm currently working on here, it's basically with the Indigenous Futures Network. So this network is a collective that it's composed of different indigenous communities, but also journalists or people who work in the territories across different states in Mexico. And the indigenous communities are very diverse. So in each territory, there's a different fight. But we have realized that all the mega projects, especially from the center to the south of Mexico, are interconnected. and therefore the fight against all of them is interconnected. So my work in the network is kind of like support from the background, all the organization that they do on any capacity that I can. So I've had the opportunity of traveling to territories and witnessing how the mega projects are destroying people's lives. So my work is communicating that it's being this network to strengthen the work that they do, defending the land. And yeah, that's part of what I do. Then also, currently I'm working on an initiative with other climate and environmental activists from Mexico to propose a new version of the non-determinated contributions that every country is supposed to submit according with the Paris Agreement. The one that we have in Mexico, it's really horrible. So we're putting together a proposal for the government to, do better. And of course, keeping the word with Fridays for Future MAPA, trying to build this platform internationally, and especially connecting with the work we do with women. So that's what I do.
Thank you for sharing. We're very glad that you're taking up projects around indigenous communities, because in conversations internationally, they're often overlooked. And we're really happy that you're taking that up. And yes, thank you for sharing. Next, I would like to ask Valentina, what are your causes and the themes that you're currently working on? We would be honored if you share that with us.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity of being here discussing this theme with such incredible women. And I think, like well mentioned, throughout the years, like seeing all of the nuances and social damage of the climate crisis in Brazil, I learned and I've been working with the notion of intersectionality. And that honestly, what they were teaching us at school, like about the technical, scientific parts of the climate crisis, didn't mean much if we weren't like urgently told about the true roots of it, like who were affected the most and the alternatives we had from a socially just perspective. So I think one thing that I work with is to try and change the national curriculum in Brazil about the climate crisis and how we are taught. And ever since I joined the climate movement, I've been trying to push for systemic change with a decolonial lenses and trying to detain all the damage that Bolsonaro's administration has been doing in Brazil, both from the social and environmental part. And also now recently that I moved to Portugal to study, I've been trying to focus on the accountability to MAPA in European politics and trying to bring this representation from inside to the European debate.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I feel it's super important to bring the ideas and the problems that the MAPA community faces, especially to the European context now. We're pretty glad that you're working on that. And yes, thank you. Now, I would like to kick off the session with questions. And I would like to start with Maria, the panel discussion. I would first like to ask you, which are the groups that are part of the MAPA for the people who don't know what it is? And do you think there are other groups that are not included in this that are also affected, that are still the people who are living in the most affected areas, are also disproportionately affected, but do not really fall into this category?
Yeah, totally. I think, first of all, it's important to recognize that the discussion around what MAPA means has been an ongoing process since we started thinking about it in 2020. So at the beginning, we thought of having this term that was, because usually when we refer to some territories that are more affected, we use the term Global South. But in this reflection, we also realized that it's not only about a specific territory being particularly vulnerable to the climate crisis. Of course, that there are regions, especially now, for example, the heat waves are hitting really, really hard. Countries like Pakistan, India, the south of America as well. So it's very evident that those countries are geographically more vulnerable to facing, the climate catastrophe. However, in the process of analyzing who were these communities more affected, we also realized that it's not only about environmental and climatic aspects. It's also about how the identities of people, social identities, political identities, religious, disability, sex, gender, political stance, work, how all those identities that are part of people put them on a place on this system of discrimination and advantages that we live on. And that makes us more vulnerable to the systemic oppressions that we live on. So when we realized that that was also inherently connected to the climate crisis, we realized that it goes beyond geographical territories, because there can be people in our same countries that even when we are in the same region, because of the privileges that they have, maybe they are middle class or class people and they can afford paying like ventilation in their houses, and therefore the heat waves are not going to hit them as hard as the people who cannot afford that. Or something that also happens a lot here where I live is that one of the biggest problems we have is water scarcity. And even that there are working class neighborhoods and rich neighborhoods in the same region. That's where I grew up, actually, in this region when they're like kind of mixed. Even though we are in the same region, the people from the rich neighborhoods, they don't suffer water scarcity because they have the resources to build these big reservoirs and hoard most of the water. But the people who barely have money to pay for the water, because we pay for the water, cannot afford this. So that's one thing, that not because you are living on a territory that's vulnerable to climatic circumstances, you are going to be affected. But also, we realized that it was not really fair to think that all the people in the global north were not touched by these systems of injustices. Because in the global north, there's also BIPOC people, Black, Indigenous people of color. There's also migrants, there are refugees, there are workers, and also systems of oppression. So maybe if you live in Canada, which is one of the richest countries in the world, but if you are an indigenous person who is fighting against oil drilling in their land, you're going to be more affected than the average person in Canada who can afford, ventilation, water, who have decent healthcare. So it's basically like that. MAPA is this concept that tries to go beyond geographical territories and incorporating how the different identities that we have, the social inequalities that go across us, that's also connected with the climate crisis.
Yes. Thank you so much. That was so insightful. And thank you for bringing light to the fact that identity and vulnerability goes beyond geographical borders. I feel that that's super important in the discussion for climate justice. Next, I would like to ask Farzana to maybe dwell a little bit about what intersectionality means to you, and what does intersectional climate justice mean for you, and how do you identify with it?
Thank you. So intersectionality is really important for climate change, and this is because, like, as you were introducing us, some of us working with indigenous people, some are someone was working with like children. Sorry,
Perfectly fine.
sorry,
It's perfectly okay.
children from our next door came to us. Sorry about that. Okay, so what I was saying is like intersectionality is like someone who's working with indigenous people. I'm working with children's right, and uh, this is like all happening because of climate change. And when we are talking about climate change, this is just increasing all other inequalities happening around us. For example, if I'm talking about women's right, the people who are in the coastal area of Bangladesh have to suffer more than the people in the cities. But even with them, the women have to suffer more because they can't move like the men can. So they have to suffer more, and the state of pregnancy and childbirth is really tough because of them, because like in the flood season they can't just go to hospital when there is floods happening. So this is really hard for women than men. And then if I'm talking about the transgender people in our country also have to go through the same problem, because of climate change they have to move. When they move, they can't adapt to a new situation, because in our country they are not welcome. And if I'm talking about transportation, same goes for the problem in transportation, because now that in our country especially people have to migrate, and we have one of the biggest internal migration rate because of climate change. So when people have to migrate, they come to city, and in city they have to live in a like slum where there is no hygiene system, there is no water supply, there is less electricity. And with more people in city, there is more problem in roads, and there are systems that can be like not implemented in the city with a plan. And it all happens because of climate change. And the intersectionality is that's why very important, because we see that everything happening, every inequalities you can name, climate change is just increasing it a lot. And when we are talking about like intersectionality, what we talk about is how we can include everyone, and how we can include every problem which is related to climate change. And when we talk about like intersectionality, we talk about the other movement which can also be like included in our movement, or we can include in their movement, so the movement actually grows bigger and bigger, and we all can ask for the rights of us. Because in this world, if you are getting affected by something, one day or another I will get affected, uh, if not by the same thing, but by the same situations, and the inequalities will hit me one way or another. And that's why we all need to work in a single umbrella. And that's why intersectionality is very important in the movement.
Thank you so much for saying that. And yeah, I totally agree. Intersectionality, any justice movement is incomplete without making it intersectional. Thank you for saying that. And for the next question, I wanted, it's a more open question to the panel, because all the governments around the world aren't clearly doing their jobs, and the media isn't covering that well. So I wanted to ask that what according to you, what does the mainstream activist movement and the media fail to recognize and address about climate justice? What are some facts that they still miss when they address climate justice in government laws, and especially when the media represents the movement? Disha, could we start with you?
I think one thing that's often missed by mainstream media is just how they glorify one person. I mean, this is something they highlight, how they glorify one person as like a hero of the movement. And they do it constantly, and they need to heroize someone for it to sell, essentially. And what this does is it ignores the fact that movements are a collective, and there are a lot of people putting in work. And it also gives the impression that one person is capable of somehow doing a lot of things, while it's always mass movements. And that way we end up putting all our hope at the hands of one person or a very small group of people, instead of actively partaking in a collective and doing our role in it. And I think another thing the media misses entirely is the fact that they always focus, when they're talking about the climate crisis, they always focus on the future instead of the present. And Farzana and Maria and Valentina have already spoken about how the climate crisis is impacting their regions and them today. And this is something we're experiencing today. It's not a future problem. It's not something in the distance. And I think this is something they don't acknowledge. When they do acknowledge it, like in India currently, we're having like a whole range of climate calamities at the moment. We're having heat waves up north and down south where I live. We're having a cyclones coming, and we're feeling the impacts of it. It's been raining throughout the day. And yesterday I had to like wade to my home in like knee-deep water. And even on the western side of India, they're having floods. So it's something that's happening to all of us at the moment, but even today it's seen as a weather issue instead of a very intersectional climate issue. And that's often missed by most mainstream media. It's only ever highlighted by very specific environmental magazines and newspapers, and it's very concerning. And I think that is something that we all need to push to change for. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for saying that. And yeah, it's really sad about the climate effects that we are currently also having everywhere and in India. I do hope you stay safe, and the rest of the people also don't die. But yeah, would anybody else like to add something to that? And else we could move forward. Okay, so now that we have this, sorry. Sorry. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, so actually, like one of the things that honestly infuriates me is the failure in recognizing how colonization is so deeply rooted in the system and is at the very root of the climate crisis. Like it shapes how we act as a movement, and society shapes the response to the climate crisis. It has been responsible for shaping the patterns of development that led MAPA to being the most affected. So giving a personal example, now that I'm living in Portugal, I'm able to see a bit of the organizing in the European activist movement. Not entirely, because I haven't managed to integrate these spaces yet, and it's like not my primary focus at the moment. But the point is, it's not even close to taking into account all the damage that these colonizers and imperialist countries have done to MAPA, and how they every day contribute to climate injustice in our communities. Like, yes, paying attention to local and national issues is important, obviously, but equal as that is fully supporting and working with the activist movement in MAPA, besides constantly making an effort to be educated on that, because I know that by personal experience, often people have just no idea of all the consequences of this historical oppression. They think it's something that has already been left behind. Like I had teachers in university telling me that Brazil had already plenty of time to develop by its own, so it had no rights of complaining about like what Europe has done to the country, which is just complete absurd. And I think the same goes for the media, and that is not surprisingly so much worse. Like they don't even mention what's happening in MAPA. I see the news here It's as I said, infuriating because uh, like while they say that the country has been going through a heat wave, there's so much worse going on in our countries, and that they just ignore. So yeah, it's just it's really upsetting.
Yes, thank you for saying that. Yeah, I agree. It's hard to avoid conversations where people don't take accountability, especially for colonialism, and feel like it's a thing of the past. Yes, I also agree. It's very infuriating with the conversation. Now, I would like to move on to the next. Yes, keep me saying that. I'm so sorry. Please go ahead.
Actually, I want to add with Disha and Valentina about this. Also, one thing media always do is wordplay, like how Germany's flood is killing people and climate change is here, and at the same time there was flood in India, and the Indian flood was a South Asian yearly thing. So that was like the wordplay media do is portraying how everything is really related to global north when it is coming to like showing how big or how devastating it is, and but when it comes to global south, it's more of like it used to happen, it always happens kind of thing. So they always use the words to downplay the problem happening in global south.
Yes, yeah, thank you for saying that. It's, yeah, the way media portrays the climate crisis in global south isn't cool. Isn't the best. But yeah, Maria, would you like to add something? Or I could go forward. Okay. Yes, now that we've also mentioned this and discussed the importance to include women and other marginalized community in the climate justice movement, the fact that we need to pass on the mic, what are some other steps that are required to gain a more gender-neutral outlook on climate justice and to make it more inclusive? Farzana, would you like to answer that?
Sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, of course. What do you think are the steps that we require to gain a more gender-neutral outlook towards climate justice and make it more inclusive? What else do we still need to do?
Okay, thank you. So when we were little, we had a proverb in our own, like it's kind of story that when men started to build a beautiful house without women's inclusion, they actually didn't include a kitchen. And yeah, this is not a good example, but if you don't include women in the narrative building, you don't know what you are losing because you don't know what they need. And you need to understand that majority in the whole world, there is almost half who are women. If sorry, if you don't including women, they are like you are not including half of the world. But this was a story or a narrative when we started with climate justice movement in our country. But now that I'm looking forward in the whole movement, we are seeing this narrative also excludes all other non-binary and LGBTQ community, because they think they are very little amount of people, so we don't need to think about it. But ultimately we also don't know what they need, so we also need to include them in the movement to know that what actually they are facing due to climate change. And the solution we are talking about about always that what the solution we need to do. The solution is already here. The local people, the women, they are adapting in their own way. They are mitigating in their own way. The LGBTQ community, they are doing it in their own way. So the solution we don't need to find. We need to include all the solution so that we can actually work on fighting climate change more than like looking for solution and how we can do it, and making big conferences where there is no woman leader, when there is no leader from non-binary community. So this is actually what we need to do. We need to include more people who have their ideas, who have their solutions already.
Yeah, thank you. It's clearly very important to include more people from certain marginalized communities as well, to pass on the mic and to make sure that their needs are also addressed when we combat climate change, or at least try to. Maria, as I said in your introduction, that you are an ecofeminist. Could you please magnify on the meaning of ecofeminism and why is it really vital to the movement for climate justice?
Yeah, totally. I would like to start by saying that I actually arrived to climate activism through feminism. And to give you some context, Mexico is one of the most dangerous countries in the world to be a woman, and the most dangerous in Latin America, because of the gender violence context. So this pushed me to feminism since I was very young, like 12 years old, because it was kind of like part of a survival strategy for me, looking for this network where I could have a safe space and where I learned strategies to defend myself in many different ways. And when I was being part of the feminist movement, there's, of course, a lot of discussion about what feminism means, how feminism applies to different communities, who identifies with feminism and who doesn't. And on that process, I discovered how historically the oppression to women is connected to the oppression to land. Because if we look at how the process of colonization was, basically colonizers arrived to our continents, to our lands, and what they took, what they used for their service, for their purposes, was mainly the natural elements that they could find around and women. So since then, since the very beginning of colonization, the oppression to land, the oppression to women are very, very like connected. So that's the kind of like the basis for the branch of ecofeminism I have been involved in. Because there's also, for example, an ecofeminism that was born in Europe, and that ecofeminism is very different to the ecofeminism that we have in Latin America, for example. And that's part of how diverse the narratives are. But basically, the main difference that, on my understanding, is that the movement in Europe, of course, that started with a very different perspective because the circumstances were very different. So that the feminist fight was connected to, taking care of the environment and more like this, on a more privileged point of view. But then in the global south, the ecofeminist movements were more connected to this part of the colonization, because that's also part of the criticism that the ecofeminist movement has faced, that, oh, was it born in Europe, but was it actually born in like the territory? So that's part of the conversation. And yeah, it basically talks about that. And I think there's a quote to sum up ecofeminism, and it says that neither women nor the land are territories for conquest. And I think that's basically what ecofeminism is about. But there's obviously also a lot of reflection about how women's connection with nature is also part of like the social roles that we are assigned to, women and people who are socialized as women, because the social roles that we are assigned to, we usually are closer to cleaning the house, taking care of children and other people, or sick related. Also, we are usually closer to tasks like preparing food, like collecting the food for preparing meals, and that is part of the sexist roles that we have been pushed to. So there's also some criticism around why do we see women as closer to nature, kind of like trying to redirect that process of thinking, that narrative. Is it because we are inherently connected, like actually inherently connected, or is it because of the social roles that we have been assigned to, and that makes us closer to nature? um, and that also brings, for example, to the conversation how if women and people socialized as women are closer to natural elements because of these roles, then we are also primarily affected when these natural elements are being affected. So again, going back to the example of the water scarcity in this region, those who realize first about the water scarcity are the mothers, the aunties, the grandmothers that are reuniting together in the wells to take the water that they need to prepare the meals, to wash the dishes. And when they do that, they realize, oh, there's less water in the wells. And now this is being more common. And when there is less water in the wells, they are the first ones on being affected because of these roles that they have to perform. If you are the person who is in charge of cleaning the house, of washing the vegetables for the whole family, for the whole community to eat, then if you don't have these resources to fulfill your tasks, you're going to be victim not only of this water scarcity crisis, but also of the gender violence that comes when you're not able to perform these activities as you are supposed to. Um, yeah, it's basically around that, and it also, for example, I have been reflecting about this a lot, especially since the 8th of March this year, because as I said, I was very involved with the rural and indigenous communities in this region that were fighting against this French company called Danone that has been filling the water for the last decades. And we realized that in our town, there had never been like a block, an ecofeminist block in in the feminist march that it brings together thousands of people. So we thought about making one, about organizing a blog, an ecofeminist blog. But in that conversation, we also realized that since the moment you call it ecofeminism or feminism, it's something that won't necessarily connect with all women and people socialized as women in rural indigenous communities, because many times the way we have to look at feminism, it's in a way that divides very strictly what being a woman means, and how women are different from men and affected on a different way. But when it comes to the fight for defending their territories, for defending their land, that is not always super clear, or it's not very well received if you try to create this division, because at the end, communities need to be all together organizing to fight against a mega project or to fight against an industry. Of course, that there are the reflections around how women and people socialized as women in the indigenous communities are definitely more affected and definitely carry more responsibility in a way. But yeah, I was just commenting that also because even though the term of ecofeminism or its concept of ecofeminism talks a lot about the connections between land and women, then that doesn't necessarily mean that all of the communities that fight for their land connect with that term, or that all the women and people women that fight for their land feel represented by that movement.
Mhm. Yes, thank you so much. That was very insightful. And yeah, ecofeminism is a very layered concept that, as you explained, that it's also just as vital to the climate justice movement. Thank you for explaining that to us. I would like to move on to Valentina. Indigenous people, we all know, play a vital part in conserving biodiversity, and yet they're one of the most impacted and neglected communities in the climate crisis. As a co-founder of SOS Amazonia, why do you think it's important for the youth climate movement to learn from indigenous communities, and what is important for them, and and especially why is it really important to organize and mobilize these movements with them?
So whenever I see these questions, I automatically think of something that I hear a lot from my friend Samila from the Sateremawe people. That is, indigenous people are already born activists. They don't get the opportunity to choose. They must do it for their own survival. And with that, they end up doing so much for our biomes and ecosystems. And without them, the wealth-oriented companies and politicians would have already destroyed most of it. But because they go against the search for profit above all, they end up being the main targets of systematic violence coming from those who want to exploit their territories. So in Brazil, indigenous peoples have been murdered and abused ever since Brazil was invaded. And the same colonial structure of 500 years ago has been responsible for their ongoing struggle to survive. It has always been like this. Like Brazil, according to the Witness report, is the fourth country that kills activists the most. And that includes mainly indigenous people. But now with Bolsonaro administration, this has become absolutely horrific. Just in this last few weeks, there have been like numerous reports of indigenous children that have been found dead, indigenous leaders killed because of land conflict, and very recently a series of threats from miners directed to a Yanomami community led to all of their houses being set on fire and them having to disappear, not to be killed. And not to mention political violence, like there's a law being discussed, the Congress, that says that the only indigenous peoples that have the right to their lands are those that had them already demarcated by the time the current Brazilian constitution was written, which makes no sense at all because the land have always been theirs. But anyways, Bolsonaro incites all of this violence alongside other imperialist powers that want to plunder Brazilian resources, and just like other indigenous people from different parts of the world suffer from the greed of world leaders who need to be deployed in favor of popular, representative, just leadership. And it's so important for us to work with them because they are already mobilizing, they are strong, they are in power, and we just need to amplify their fight and just act according to their needs and following their leadership, because there will be no climate justice without following indigenous people. There is no intersectional fight without that, and it's up to us to listen to them and to just like let them pave the way to climate justice.
Yes, thank you so much. That was also very insightful in giving how important indigenous people are for especially this battle for crisis. This I would like to open the question to the panel. And what have your experiences been as a non-male navigating through climate activism, leading it and being a vital part of the movement nationally and internationally, saving, especially with facing resistance from the government and other communities and the media. So how has your experience been? And can I start with Disha?
I think it's two-sided really, because I think when I initially started my work in international spaces, I think that was in around the pandemic, so the beginning of 2020, and it wasn't very welcoming because it was mostly white Europeans, but now it's amazing because I found a community in MAPA that I know will always be there for each other and have each other's backs. And I think it is really what keeps me going, because knowing, just having a wonderful community that wants to achieve the same things as you do and that wants a place of justice and love is what keeps us driving forward. And I have so many lovely friends, all of who are, some of who are on this panel. So it's actually a really lovely place to be in now, and it's become a safe space for women, because I think most climate movements that I've worked in have been led by women, and I've just pinned it down to, maybe it's because we've been impacted by the climate crisis more and in very different ways than men would, that we actually work on making a difference. And all my best friends in the climate movement are women. So now it's become a safe space for me to do what I want to do and expect support and also provide support. So I'm very grateful for the movement for so many things, but yeah, especially because they taught me radical love and how transformational justice works.
Thank you for saying that. That's very warm that you have found a nice community and a safe space in the climate justice movement. Would any of you like to add something to that? You can just go ahead and unmute yourself.
Maybe, yeah, I think so. Oh, Farzana just lifted her hand.
Valentina, you can go first.
Okay, so Farzana, since you're already unmuted, you go first.
Actually, Disha already started that we are in a community which is like led by women, and that's why we have seen that the women around us is making the movement strong, which is really true. And but there is also another side when we want to work outside the movement, like for example, if we are trying to reach our government. We have seen so less women in the whole decision-making panel. So there was nobody actually say it in your face that yes, you are a woman, that's why you can't actually join it. But you know there is hurdles in every situation because of the system which is led by the men, so the ideas is more of in men's favor. So nobody say it in my face that okay, you can join it. But when we talk about a thing which is more focus on women, they're like, no, we want to include everyone. But when they want to talk about include everyone, they only mean men but not women. So this happens when you are outside the movement and want to work on decision making panels.
Thank you. Valentina, would you like to add something?
Yeah, it's really quick actually. I just wanted to add that I agree so much with this part of like the movement being mostly like organized by women, and it's so good to have this caring community around us. But like a personal experience, not really on a positive note. This is also something that I talked about with migrant activists here, is that it's like as soon as we move here, we start being acknowledged by like European activists and society in general, as if suddenly we weren't like from our countries anymore, as if suddenly we were born here, we had the same experiences, same background, and as if like we didn't have a say anymore, like in what happens in our countries and in our communities. And it's a little bit hurtful because it's sort of like it feels like an erasure, if that makes sense. But at the same time, when it's convenient for them, it also happens like they kind of ignore that we are here and they just like, okay, no, we're just a fake European. We don't want to talk to you. So it's very confusing. It's a mix of feelings. Yeah, it's hard to navigate through that.
Yes, thank you for sharing. I understand this has been, this must be really hard. Maria, would you like to have something too? I'm sorry, we can't really hear you.
So,
Okay, I think this is better. Could you say something now?
yeah, is it better now?
Oh, perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to add on this part of how I think, especially what's going on in FFF MAPA has so much potential because, yes, we see a lot of climate movements, climate organizations being led by women, or even the representation increasing in like the UN spaces, negotiation spaces. But I think we have to look beyond the gender and analyze who are actually those people who are there, because it's actually not necessarily like useful for advancing this inclusive representation if you have like hegemonic women, you know, that feel this, how do you say it, like that it's the profile that it's usually accepted by the media because, you know, they like to see maybe someone who is white from the global north who is speaking. But when we try to push for women, more diverse women, for having representation, that's when we face some like you know, confrontation or a lot of tokenization also. I think it goes beyond looking at the gender. We also have to include diversity of women and people socialized as women. We need to include women of color, we need to include indigenous women, we need to include disabled women, women who are refugees especially, or who are migrants that also face a lot of discrimination and oppression in the global north countries. So I just wanted to add on that it goes beyond just saying, oh, we need to include the representation that women have in these spaces. It's looking also at what are the different identities that are intersecting those women, and why putting someone who has a lot of privileges because of their the place they were born in, or the inherently the identity they have. It's not the same as putting someone who is in the front line of the climate crisis, or who has a different understanding of the different oppressions that that person has had to face in their life.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. That was actually, it's so important to recognize the fact, and the fact that representation is so important. I would like to, so we don't have a lot of time, but I would like to keep the questions shorter. But Okay, so what, according to you, I would like to open this question to the panel. There is an importance of systemic change regarding climate crisis, especially the mitigation and adaptation strategies that are adopted by the countries around the world. I think, Valentina, you also mentioned in an interview that systemic change is sort of the root of the change that we need for especially leading the movement of climate justice. Would you also like to shed some light on that?
Yeah, sure. So, very shortly, we cannot want to change something by just keeping the same system that caused what we are fighting against. Like all of these issues were caused by an imperialist, sexist, or racist system that if we cannot fight against it and tackle it, we won't get anywhere. Like any movement that fails to recognize this and all like of the intersectionality and systemic like oppressions, it will fail if it cannot fight it. Yeah, I think that like individually, there's honestly like not very like much things we can do like besides organizing within our community and like sharing the word and amplifying the voices of the most affected and basically doing this community and grassroots work. And personally, I think that this is where we will get most far. But yeah, I truly believe in the power of like popular organization and yeah.
Yes, thank you for shedding some light on that. Would someone like to add on that? Okay, then I will move on to the next question. Farzana, you also mentioned in an interview that the recent COP activists were tokenized and the sentences like were taken out of context just for headlines. Like we were talking about representation a bit before. Would you like to say something more on why it's really important that different marginalized communities are correctly represented and how are they currently represented and what should be probably done better for that?
Thank you. So, as you have already mentioned that we always talk about tokenization because we have seen it a lot of time that they just want a quota from global south and just so that they are not called out. That's why they always want someone from global south, and then there is a whole panel who are like white people talking about the problem of global south. And there is also another fact now that we are talking about feminism also. I have actually worked with people at past that they want someone from someone who is a woman in a panel so that the panel don't look sexist, but ultimately they didn't actually recognize that she is also working as same as the man in that panel. And the saddest part what is like when they were talking about how they want to make that panel, what usually happen when there is all women, then like currently then it is about how activists are working. But when they always make a quota that so that they don't feel bad so that they don't like the thing don't look bad. But this is not about their recognizing it, it's more about their tokenizing so that the all things look good from outside, but the inside part or the main discussion always goes like how they want, not how actually the discussion should be. And also about media, we talked about it before as well, that they don't like wanna share what you wanna share, but they wanna make a headline so that they pick one line which is out of context, and you read and you're like, no, I didn't say that, but maybe I said, but without the context, that line doesn't sounds like me. And that happens a lot, and happened a lot in COP when we talked about some part and there was only the part they wanna hear. And that's what we always talk about, tokenization. And also, if I am talking about greenwashing, companies are always doing that. And uh, a lot of people is thinking, oh, this company is now going net zero, but we in the movement know net zero is a scam. When companies are like painting us green, that yes, we will go by 20, like go green by 2030, but we will uh, like funding fossil fuel by 2029. So you can't go green by 1 year, and this is not a true thing you are saying. And that's what greenwashing is doing, which is like more harming than directly supporting the fossil fuel.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, you're absolutely correct. It's really, it does more harm than good. But it's the correct, it's just not just representation, but correct representation is extremely vital for the movement. For the next question, this one is my favorite as well. So there are very certain trials and tribulations to being an activist, and being a climate activist, knowing how urgent the crisis is and how non-urgent the response of the world is. How do you cope with climate anxiety and activism fatigue? Because it's genuine, this is like a personal question for me as well. Disha, would you like to start?
Yeah, I have a lot of hot takes on climate anxiety in general. There's this quote, I don't remember who it's by, but it essentially just goes, my world is ended a million times and become the same the next day. And I feel like it pretty much sums up how I feel about climate anxiety. I've gotten really used to the climate crisis, and so has my mother. Yes, like yesterday, wading through water, I know it isn't something that people should be experiencing, and people lost their homes in my city. And like, I live in Bangalore, it's a landlocked city, and we're still seeing flooding. It's a little bit ridiculous, but it's kind of come to the point where we've gotten domesticated to the violence, and climate change is a violence. And I wake up the next day and I move on with it. I don't think it's terrifying every single time, but I've gotten used to it because of how many times it's just happened at this point. It's no different than any other day, and it's kind of a sad perspective when I say it out loud, because people expect me to share about how anxious it makes me, but I'm just honestly used to it at this point. I live with it. So it feels a little ridiculous to me when people talk about climate anxiety and they live in the global north and their experiences are so limited. Like, I understand that you're anxious about what is to come, but we're already experiencing it. And they're probably safer because, you know, the whole world is rooting to mitigate it for them to some extent, at least. They really don't care about us down south. So I have my hottest take is that it's just, I'm used to it, and I know I shouldn't be, but I have gotten used to so many things that are very violent in nature, but it shouldn't be the case, but it is what it is, unfortunately. So yeah, I don't know if that's like an answer you were expecting, but it's actually one of the most honest answers. Normally I do tell that I am anxious about it, and I am, but I think over time it just grew on me.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing. It was, I wasn't expecting anything, but it's so nice to know that it's quite the same feeling. But yeah, I once again wish you safety with flooding. And yes, thank you again for sharing. Maria? Would you like to say something more to that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was actually thinking about that like 3 days ago, of how I was questioning myself and questioning whether I actually feel climate anxiety, because I definitely feel anxiety like a lot, but it mixes with anxiety for so many different things that it kind of like, I don't know if calling it climate anxiety it's the most accurate term anymore. Because for example, for me, it was very heavy that a year ago I was sick during several months because I drank polluted water. And that until today has been a health issue for me. So for me, kind of like there is a connection between knowing that here it's something that we know when there's not going to be water for some time, we are able to predict it. So people get prepared and we don't waste water or use a lot of water, so that we know that next week we're not going to have water, like water supply, so that the water that we get this week, it should be enough. So when I hear that, and that's something that happens very often, that triggers a lot the anxiety that I got from being sick, from being in the hospital for that, from being traveling, being sick. And that is on a way connected to the water scarcity issue that we have and the whole climate crisis issue, but it kind of like mixes with anxiety for so many things. Or for example, also something that I have experienced a lot engaging with indigenous communities is that in Mexico, maybe in other regions of the world also happens, but one of the strategies that the government uses to isolate indigenous communities is that usually in those regions, there's no signal, there's no internet connection, there's no running water, there's sometimes not even roads. So those communities end up being very isolated. Um, and because of that, when you are visiting one of those communities, you feel very anxious, and the fear increases that if something happens, nobody's gonna find out, nobody's gonna know. And if suddenly there's a bunch of police cars arriving through the mountains and they disappear everyone, nobody's gonna know. So that gives a lot of anxiety, and it is connected to this whole thing of, the police being a tool for the transnational companies to do their dirty business in the territories. But I feel like, I don't know if calling it climate anxiety, it's the most accurate thing, because it definitely mixes with a lot of things like personal security and community security. And I feel like visualizing it is also important to understand how the climate anxiety that we feel, it's just different, and it's rooted on also different things because of the context we live on.
Yes, I totally agree with that. Our climate anxiety is just as intersectional as you're trying to make the justice movement. Yeah, with Valentina or Farzana, would you like to add something to that? Okay. Finally, we have what are some steps that you think are very necessary to combat barriers to change in the future of climate action? I would like to open it to the panel. Whoever feels comfortable answering can unmute. Okay, I can start with Maria. You?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Okay. What steps? What are the necessary steps to combat barriers to change in the future of climate activism? Yeah. How do we fight these barriers that sort of are resistant to the fights that we do against change?
Yeah, that question can be answered in many different ways. And I think that's part of it. There's no blueprint for climate justice. There's no definite, formula or guidelines for achieving climate justice. So I think that something that is very important is to kind of like know that there's no single way that it can be done, and therefore it's very important that we do something on whatever capacity that we can, on whatever sector that we are involved in, that we do something. Maybe if you're a journalist, you don't need to be an activist. If you're a journalist, if you're inside the UN spaces, inside the political spaces, there's something you can do, because there's no blueprint for achieving climate justice, and therefore that gives us so many options. I think that's one first thing, acknowledging that there's no single way, and therefore all the efforts that we do are necessary, are valid. It's valid to find different ways to fight. It doesn't have to be everyone, let's join Fridays for Future and let's strike for the climate. If you do, that's great. But if you organize in different ways, that's completely valid as well. That's one first thing. However, I did think that the whole climate justice movement or climate movement, it's not going to be successful if we don't acknowledge that the climate crisis is a human rights issue. If we spend a lot of time talking about, oh yeah, let's invest more on green energy because it is economically viable and because some people are getting sick from the pollution of the cars in the cities, I mean, that's part of the conversation. But if you only stay in that, you are ignoring the whole social inequality component. And I feel like without speaking about that, any solution that we come up for the climate crisis might actually make deeper the inequalities or the systems of oppression that some people have to face. So for example, and that's just how I like to explain it, we know that because of the massive amount of emissions that the fossil fuel industry had put in the atmosphere, we are now in a climate crisis. And because of that, we need to transit to ways of generating energy that are less polluting. And one of those ways, and one of the favorite ways, has been wind farms. Wind farms are one of these clean energies that are being implemented in the south of Mexico a lot, because there's a lot of wind, there's a lot of like valleys, so it's geographically very, it's a good territory to implement the wind farms. However, to install these wind farms, you need land. And usually that land belongs to peasants, belongs to indigenous communities. That land is a land that they use to feed their families. That land is their culture, their indigenous culture, something that they were given by their ancestors. And when the government and the private companies arrive and want to install these wind farms, they don't ask. They give you two options. You either agree to them installing the wind farms, and they're going to give you a very ridiculous amount of money every year, or they just do it and pass over you. That is climate action, because these wind farms are going to help to reduce the polluting emissions of the countries in having. But that is not climate justice at all, because you are stepping on people's land, you're stepping on peasants and indigenous communities to install those wind farms. So I want you to stay with that example for when you think about the difference between climate action and climate justice.
Yes, thank you for bringing forward a very important point. I also remember you saying that at one of another summits that it's not climate justice if it's only climate action in your territories. And I feel it's really, really important to recognize that. I would like to ask if somebody else would like to add on to that. Then, then I would like to ask a final question before we move on to the audience questions. We're all very intrigued to know what are your next projects that we can join you in and contribute to, maybe in person, maybe in person or virtually. So we are all very intrigued in knowing that. Valentina, can I ask you that first?
Yeah, sure. So you talked about the SOS Amazon campaign, and I wanted to let you know that we still need support. It's a crowdfund, so we're still receiving donations. Like actually, we depend. Sorry, we depend on the donations to be able to do everything. And another thing is that we are really focusing on the upcoming elections that we have on October to hopefully take Bolsonaro out of power, because honestly, we can't stand more 4 years of him. We desperately need change, so we are developing a campaign around that, and probably it will become public soon. And I'm sure we will need all support. But even if we didn't have that campaign, any support regarding like elections and like international solidarity, that's so important. But that's basically it. I just came back from like a season of just burnout. I couldn't do anything, so that's why I'm not involved in a lot of things. But I'm slowly coming back, and hopefully, like eventually, I'll have more projects. I just don't know them yet, but I will do.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'm sure everybody here would like to support you and everyone here in these causes, and they care about these. And if they don't, I hope we could have turned them after this seminar. Farzana, would you like to say something about your future projects and something that we could contribute to?
Okay, so in our national group, we are currently, as I already said, are currently trying to push renewable energy more, and especially in the cities, in the rooftop, so that people start to use solar energy in the rooftop, and we are currently working on it. And but also in MAPA level, mainly FFF Africa actually launched a campaign about climate finance and loss and damages. So as MAPA, we are also supporting them. It's a campaign about like learning about how climate finance is working, and why we need finance, and how actually debt cancellation is so much important, and why reparation is not charity. It's more of like a both an educational campaign where we educate more people, but also a campaign where we actually ask the global north government to start talking about climate finance in COP27. So actually in MAPA, we are also supporting FFF Africa, as we are saying that COP27 will be the African COP and Global South COP. So that's what we are doing right now.
Thank you for sharing. We would for sure read up more on that and try to support in the best we can. Disha, would you like to go next?
So at the moment, I am working. I think we'll continue to work with Hasteo until that is seen through, and we're also going to be working around a few climate educational projects to raise more awareness on just a general topic, given the climate calamities we're facing, and tied into how it's intersectional and needs political action. And you can follow fridaysforfuture.india and support us there.
Yes, for sure. I am sure everybody heard it, and I will pass on the message a little bit by force if I have to. But yes, thank you for sharing that. Maria, would you like to go next?
Yeah, this is actually not something that I particularly are very involved with, but it's one of the issues, very pressuring issues in MAPA right now. So as I was mentioning before, recently there have been heat waves hitting Pakistan very, very hardly. And a nation or a community that's also in that region is Balochistan. Balochistan is this region that has been colonized and is currently under the oppression of the states of Pakistan, Iran, and Afghanistan. So because of that, these people have been fighting for their liberation for the longest time. But now because of the heat wave, there is a very strong problem of water scarcity in the region, and that kind of like triggered a cholera outbreak. And at the same time, the healthcare facilities in the region are not really good, are not super accessible to everyone. So in Fridays for Future International, we are starting a crowdfunding to try to get resources to people from these communities. It's being very challenging because the government is also preventing the community from receiving donations. But we're trying really hard to redirect resources to them. So if I could share the post and you want to repost and share, that will be very, very useful. Because currently, as I said, at least 21 people have passed away because of the cholera outbreak. And this is something that we could help to prevent with direct communications to them.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. For sure, we would like to help in sharing the information and mobilizing it more, especially online. Now I would like to open the floor to the audience present here with us. But we're running a bit short on time, so we could take one or two questions. Do we have any questions? So yeah, I think we each covered quite a bit of topics. Oh yes, I keep missing people. Sorry.
I wanted to ask if there's any way you could share maybe links or something to the project that people of the panel would share. Maybe on Instagram or somewhere.
Yeah.
But I didn't get all of them.
Okay. So people here want to know if they could, if there are links on your Instagram or something to the projects that we just mentioned so that they could contribute to that more. Or yes, or we could ask email queue and then post it on the Instagram for Fridays for Future as well. Students for Future as well. Yes. Great. Thank you. Do you have more questions? Can I pick somebody? Okay. So, okay. Thank you. So thank you so much to our panelists for being here with us and shedding light on such important topics. I'm really glad that I got through this without any inappropriate fangirling. I would also like to thank our audience for joining us and contributing with such insightful questions. And lastly, I would like to thank the people at Students for Future for organizing Public Climate School and organizing and creating the space for the conversations that are essentially very important for the climate justice movement. Thank you for being here.